appreciate you joining me for God, Country, and the American Story. There's a lot to talk about. You have a new book we're going to discuss called The Color of Death. But before we get into that, I want to start somewhere sort of unique. A lot of people know you, obviously, for the incredible career you've had serving in Congress. Obviously, now you're working with Fox News, you're doing a lot on screen. But I want to talk a little bit about your faith journey because, as somebody who has worked as a prosecutor, an author, a TV host, you know, people might not know that background. So, what was that journey? How did you come into faith?
Well, I grew up with two parents that every time the church doors were open, we were there, even if it meant missing Dallas Cowboy football games. I literally remember my dad yanking me at halftime of a Cowboys 49ers game to go to what we call training union. I mean, not only did we go on Wednesdays and Sunday mornings, we had to go on Sunday nights. So even when God's team was playing, we had to go to church. But then, I think a lot of people that grow up that way go through what the Irish poets call a dark night of the soul, where you begin to question that. I went to a Baptist school in Baylor. Um, but truth be told, I had one of those dark nights of the soul, actually watching Billy Graham on a black and white television, sitting by myself. And I just thought there has to be more to life than what I've been doing for the first 21 years. I guess I was 21 at that point. And so my relationship with God, this is very controversial. I've cleared it with Tim Scott that it's okay for me to say. He's a man of unassailable faith. I wonder how many of us would follow Jesus's teachings even if there was no reward at the end. And what
Mm.
I mean by that is, um, you know, all of us want to live forever, but his teachings are good enough that even if we didn't live forever, it's still the right way to conduct life as we have it. It's
Mm.
ironically one of my favorite books in the Bible is Habakkuk, who is a pretty obscure prophet, but he asked God a lot of tough questions, like, how can you let this happen? And as a prosecutor, I found myself asking that a lot. And it adversely impacted my faith because um, I couldn't reconcile, all things work together for good for those that believe in God. And I have got three murdered children under the age of 11 in a week. And
Wow.
I mean, but the way I console myself is you don't have a conversation with someone you don't believe in. So it's okay to ask God tough questions. Where I would begin to worry about myself is if I just said, "I'm not going to ask you anymore." There's a line in Alexander Dumas' book, The Count of Monte Cristo, where Edmond Dantes says, "I don't believe in God," and the priest says, "That's okay. He believes in you." I mean, his existence does not depend upon what I think or believe. And so it's hard to be like upset or angry with someone like the prophet Habakkuk was if you don't believe that person exists.
Right.
So it's a complicated faith. The teachings of Christ are worth following, period. Whether there's an afterlife or not, I hope there is one. I have faith there is one. I cannot tell you I know there is one because I don't know anyone who's gone and returned. Even Lazarus did not say, "Hey, let me tell you what heaven's like." I mean, we have this apocryphal, apocalyptic book called Revelation that, it's kind of hard to figure out. I found myself surrounding my cynical self with people of tremendous faith, like my wife, and the people that I gravitate towards have this authentic faith about them. So clearly, I am drawn to that. Clearly, I wish I lived up to all of Jesus's teachings. I'm a little bit cynical about how religion has been used by politicians. I think it has hurt the church. I think it's helped certain politicians, but I think it's hurt the overall reputation of the church.
Yeah, well, you said a lot there that I have a lot of questions about. And I'll tell you, Senator Scott was on our first episode, and so he's always wonderful to chat with. And I love that friendship that you have there. It's interesting because the position you were in, I mean, you were describing a situation where you're seeing murder and death and chaos all the time, and you have to try to square that with the reality of a God who loves and who created, right? And that question of why did he allow this? That's a question that comes up again and again and again for people. Did you find a lot of ebbs and flows in your journey as a prosecutor and even in serving in Congress? Gosh, in where you found yourself struggle at moments, and then you sort of had the victory, and then you go back to struggling again because those cases pull you more towards those questions, I would imagine.
Yeah, I remember sitting down with a friend of mine who also happened to be the Sunday school teacher that my wife and I attended the Sunday school class, and he asked me to read a book called The Shack because he knew I was struggling, and I read The Shack, and I just accepted the fact that kind of what God said to Habakkuk: "Who are you to ask me why I've done something?" I mean, it's okay for you to ask, but even if I told you, you wouldn't understand it because you view life and time through a dimension that I don't view it through. So, I picture this image, like take Camp Mystic, which was a really, really hard day for people of faith. I mean, you sit there and these children are going to a camp to learn more about God. And the reward for that is a flood that washes their life away. And the only thing that can comfort me is that they're with the person that loved them even more than us as parents love our children. And that's the one that created them. Jesus singled children out for special treatment. I mean, he was pretty careful to warn people of what you do to kids. So I do have these slew of desponds, as Milton referred to, these dark nights of the soul. What's important to me is that I keep asking the questions because when I stop, then I become a full blown cynic, and that's when I would worry. I don't worry that I sit there and say, God, how could you let a 6 year old be shot at her birthday swimming party? How could you allow that? I think he's big enough for me to ask tough questions of.
Well, and I think from a Christian perspective, knowing that, he came down in human form through Jesus and lived a life and understands the temptations and the struggles and the questions that people have, that I think he understands why we ask those questions, right? I mean, there's a deep
Yes.
understanding there. And so you mentioned a couple of things there, even about politics, and we're going to get to the book in a moment. But I want to ask you this because as America is about to celebrate 250 years, one of the biggest debates, obviously, is over the First Amendment and the role of religion. And yes, politicians really on both sides, interestingly, have used faith. I think we see it a lot on the progressive side now, even where politicians are showing up at these progressive churches and preaching. For a long time on the right, this has been something we've seen. This role of faith, and you mentioned the teachings of Jesus being important, whether there was a heaven or a hell or not, that living this way is actually beneficial to the individual life and even the corporate life. When you look at how faith should intersect, and I know this is a big question, but I'm curious of your perspective with government and with the American way of life, whether we should have a Christian identity or not. What's your thought on that?
In the world, but not of the world. That I look at this intersection of the church and politics over the last 30 or 40 years, and I think that the role and the image of the church has been diminished. And I think that our reliance on the state has been increased. And I think that's been to the detriment of the church. Jesus didn't have a whole lot to say about politics, even though he lived under foreign invaders. You can certainly argue he didn't get much due process, but all he said is render under Caesar what is Caesar's. Paul, I think, I mean, you're the Bible scholar, not me, but I'm pretty sure Paul said there are no leaders except those that God has put in place. That's, it's one thing to listen and hear that if you don't like Barack Obama or Donald Trump. Imagine living in Cambodia under Pol Pot and reading that verse. There are no leaders except those that God has put in place. So I worry that this mixture of when I hear a politician say that it's a shame Jesus did not have an AR 15 or an AK 47 to defend himself, that just shows me such a fundamental misunderstanding of who he was and why he came. That the notion, this is the same guy that picked up a Roman soldier's ear and put it back in place after
Yeah.
after Peter cut it off. And you mean to tell he had an army of angels he could have called down. He didn't need a firearm. And if you think that he came to live, then you have not read the New Testament. He came to die. So that's what worries me is that we talk about God and Jesus when it benefits us politically, and then when it doesn't, we say, well, we're not going to honor that part of it. We're not going to pray for our enemies. We're not going to love our enemies. That I think is hurting religion. It,
It doesn't add up to the when you're doing these things that don't line up with what scripture says and you're doing it under the guise of scripture, that becomes a problem, obviously, and it becomes more about politics than it does faith, but it masquerades as faith at that point.
and I think that's why you're seeing some young people perhaps check out of organized religion is because of the disconnect, the cognitive dissonance between what I hear and what I see. I actually wrote a line in the book where the prosecutor said, I see more Jesus in a waitress than I have seen in 1,000 sermons. So if you show me an authentically lived life, I was a decent cross examiner in court. I have no cross examination for an authentically lived life. I could never cross examine my wife successfully because she authentically lives out her Christian faith. I can cross examine almost anybody except an authentically lived life. I can't do it.
Okay, so I'm going to come back to this after because I have some other questions, but I want to talk about the color of death because I think it's interesting in light of the conversation we're having about the heaviness that you've dealt with, obviously in Congress, in the courtroom, dealing with cases surrounding murder, these very heavy things, and yet you're writing fiction now, right? That is inspired though by real things. Talk about what it's been like to write fiction and where you've gotten your inspiration for The Color of Death.
Well, I want to thank my boss, Suzanne Scott. She's the one that pushed me to do it. It's been in my head for a decade. I just didn't have the courage to put pen to paper. I mean, I've written 3 nonfiction books, one with Timmy, and then 2 kind of self-help books. It would have stayed in my head, except Miss Suzanne Scott said, "No, you're going to write this book," and I did it sitting at this desk, and there were a lot of tears, to be honest with you, because it brought back a ton of memories of what I did for nearly 2 decades. Every part of my county, I see a crime scene. No matter how beautiful the scenery, no matter how happy the occasion, the way prosecutors' minds work is that's where this happened. That's where this crime took place. I was taking my son to play golf, and I find myself looking down this road because that's where Brent Horton almost did cut his wife's head off with a sword. So I'm ignoring the mountains. I'm ignoring autumn. I've got my son with me, and I am thinking about a crime I prosecuted 6 years before that. And you can't get it out of your head. You can't get the crime scene photos out of your head. So, yeah, it's fiction, but it's written from a standpoint of someone who actually lived it because most miniseries and movies do not accurately portray what we do. I mean, we're at the crime scene the night it happens. We don't show up the morning of jury selection and say, let me see the file. We are there from the moment it happens. That's why you can't get the crime scenes out of your head. It's because you saw them.
Yeah. Yeah, that's unimaginable, honestly. I think we don't often think about prosecutors, attorneys in general, police officers, first responders, the amount of things that people are seeing that remain with them and I would imagine affect you. Obviously, you said you're in tears as you're going back through these memories working on this book. And I think it's important that this fiction book is inspired by real experience that you've had. How do you, in that role as a prosecutor, how did you, and maybe this is a weird question, maybe you would say, well, I never had that experience, but were there ever times where you felt like it was uncertain whether this person was guilty. I mean, how do you deal with a situation where you're feeling like there maybe isn't enough evidence, or you're struggling through the balance of justice and truth and all of that? I mean, there's so much there.
Well, prosecutors have a lot of power, so we can also mete out mercy. I prosecuted drug cases for 6 years, and then once you see, child sex assault, rape, murder, it kind of reprioritizes what's most important in life. I'm not minimizing drug cases. I did them for
Sure.
6 years. They're important. But I focused on violent crime. When you hurt another person, when you rob them of their life or their innocence, um, that's when I ratcheted up a little bit. I only had one person and I'm actually really prosecutors clear more innocent people than any criminal defense attorney could ever do in a career. And that's the other story that's not told. They
Yeah.
were viewed as like putting notches on our belt. I'm really proud of the fact that the DEA brought me a case and said this guy's on video selling drugs, and it looked a whole lot like him. But he came and said, "I'm telling you, it's not me." And not to spoil the ending, but lots of defendants lie. A lot of them say it's not me when it really is. But I told him, I said, "Okay, if it's not you, who was it?" And he said, I'll find out and come back." And sure enough, about a month later, he came back and said, "This is who it was." I would have convicted him. He would have been convicted. He looked enough like the person on the video that a jury would have convicted him. But it was the wrong person. And then we went and got the right person, and he confessed and goes, "Yeah, that's me."
Wow.
I take as much pride in that as I do any murder conviction, because an innocent person was not incarcerated because I stopped to listen to him with skepticism. I said, "Look, you got to go convince me it wasn't you," but he did. So
Yeah.
I didn't have to prosecute people where there was doubt. Particularly in a homicide case, it's my job to get from arrest or probable cause to beyond a reasonable doubt. And I can't imagine. Look, I mentioned the Count of Monte Cristo. There's no worse feeling than being punished for something you did not do. No worse. You want to talk about losing faith in God? Go get punished for something you didn't do. So,
Yeah.
why would I ever prosecute someone that I thought or had even any suspicion was not guilty when there's so many guilty people to go pick from?
Right. Right.
I
Yeah,
mean,
I love that you
I had an
clarified
office
that.
full of guilty people. I never had to go pick one I was unsure about.
I love that you clarified that, because I think people do have that perspective, right? They make this assumption that there's like some sort of joy in prosecuting people that prosecutors have. And I think in light of what you've described, there's a heavy weight on people who are taking this position on. And going back to the book, as you were prepping this and going back through cases and looking at real things and putting the color of death together, I have to ask, when people are done reading this book, which by the way is already incredibly successful, when they're done reading it, what do you want them thinking and feeling?
I want them to know what it's like to be surrounded by darkness and grief, and that the light ultimately does win. It was important to my wife that I put light in this book, and the light comes in the form of a waitress. But the light wins, and it doesn't matter her role. She's not a judge. She's not a lawyer. She's a waitress. But the light is going to win if you can just hang in there long enough. So that was kind of the moral subplot. The real reason I wrote it is because the miniseries and the movies and the TV shows do not capture what prosecutors, the connection between cops and prosecutors is an incredibly strong bond. And with victims and prosecutors, it never goes away. I mean, I still bump into people where I prosecuted the man that killed a loved one, and there is a connection that will never go away because grief and pain are unifying. And so the best prosecutors put themselves in the position of those that are hurting the most. And it does take a toll, which is why I couldn't do it forever. I did not run for Congress. I ran away from the courthouse. And it just so happened that Congress was an honorable exit. But the truth is, I didn't care whether I went to the Attorney General's office, Congress, private practice. I didn't care. I just had to get away from the darkness.
Wow. And, so it's interesting. You literally read my mind because the next question I had for you is what was it that made you go into, I mean, to run for Congress, serve the years you did? Some would argue there's a different type of light and darkness that you might find in Congress, depending on what you're dealing with, who you're working with. What was the toughest part, the toughest factor of serving in Congress for you personally?
That there are no rules. There's no judge. There are no rules of evidence. The only goal is to win. I mean, I had to win and also follow the rules in court. I had to turn over all my discovery. I had to play face up poker, nothing hidden. If you lie to a judge, you lose your credibility. In politics, it is if you have this jersey, you're my teammate, and I want you to win. If you don't have on this jersey, I want you to lose. And there's no judge, there's no referee. So, I mean, I'm sitting in congressional hearings listening to questions that have no relevance whatsoever to the witness, but there's no one to object. I mean, so on the one hand, Congress is like kindergarten compared to the courthouse. The courthouse is much harder, is much more substantive to me. The downside to Congress, we have all these investigations that end in nothing. I can't indict anyone. I can't prosecute anyone. People would stop me at the grocery store and say, "Why haven't you put X in jail?" But because I can't. That's why, because I can't. That was my old job. I cannot do that. So a little frustration with the lack of civics and knowing whose role is what. But the main frustration was the absence of rules.
Mm,
No fairness. Fairness to me is beauty. I mean, there's a reason we used to say, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest one of all?" Fairness and beauty are the same thing. And there's just no fairness in politics anymore, to me.
yeah. Do you miss it ever?
Never.
Yeah. Well,
I
you're
miss
getting to
my
do
friends,
a
but
lot
they're
more
all
now.
gone. I
Yeah.
mean, Tim is still there. McCarthy left. Ratcliffe is at the CIA. Most of my friends are in the Senate now and not the House. I mean, I love Mike Johnson. We had a great relationship. I have other friends. Most of them have become chairman now. But part of me, my heart hurts for them because when they leave, they will feel a liberation that you can't feel when you're there.
Mm.
And, you know, like kind of like Gollum with his ring, that you get addicted to that member pin, and which is why I quit wearing it when I was in the House. After my first term, I just quit wearing it. I didn't want to become. First of all, I don't care if people remember that I was in Congress. It's not what I want to be remembered for. So I am sympathetic to those that feel like it is their identity and they can't leave, because the most liberated people I know are former members of Congress and the Senate.
So that's powerful. And it brings me to my final question. What do you want to be remembered for?
A good husband, a good father, and a fair prosecutor.
I love that.
Short. You don't have to say much to my wife. Walking, first of all, don't ask her out when you're walking through the receiving line. That'd be the first thing I ask, because she's really pretty and really sweet, and I don't want people asking her out. I want her to live as a widow, lonely and constantly thinking of me and not selling my golf clubs. But I want them to say he was a pretty good husband, pretty good father, and a fair prosecutor, and move on.
I love that. Well, this has been a great conversation. The book is The Color of Death. Run out and grab it wherever books are sold. Appreciate your time today.
Thank you. I've enjoyed this very much. Thank you.